Marcella Vescuri's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. "Put that down. You don't eat until the floor is clean." Nia Whitmore Viscari stood at the kitchen counter, 8 months pregnant, her back aching, her swollen feet barely fitting into the slippers she'd shuffled downstairs in. She had been reaching for a bowl of soup, a bowl that Maria, the housekeeper, had quietly prepared for her. Before her fingers even touched it, Marcella snatched it from the counter and handed it to one of the household staff standing nearby. Like it was nothing, like Nia was nothing. "You heard me," Marcella said again, pointing at the shattered ceramic near the far wall, pieces of a vase that one of the young soldiers had knocked over 20 minutes ago. "That mess doesn't clean itself." Nia's hand dropped to her belly. Instinct, protection. She said quietly, "Marcella, I'm due in 4 weeks." "I know exactly when you're due." Marcella turned her back. "Doesn't change the floor. If you were standing in that room right now, if that was your daughter, your sister, your wife, what would you do? And if the man who was supposed to protect her walked through that door and saw it for himself, what would he become?" Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now because we release stories like this every single week. Stories that will stop you mid-breath. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into part 1, and I promise you, by the time this is over, you'll understand why Dante Viscari was never the same man again. The night Dante came home, Chicago was cold, in that particular way it gets in late November. Not dramatic, not storming, just quietly, persistently brutal. The kind of cold that settles into your coat and stays there. He had been gone for 11 days negotiating the end of a territorial dispute that had been bleeding money and men from 3 of his most profitable operations on the north side. He wasn't supposed to be back until Thursday. It was Tuesday. He sat in the back of the black SUV while his driver, Ren, navigated the expressway without speaking. That was one of the things Dante valued about Ren. The man understood silence. After 11 days of coded conversations, veiled threats dressed up as business proposals, and rooms full of men who smiled with their mouths and calculated with everything else, silence felt like oxygen. In his coat pocket was a small silver music box. He'd picked it up from an antique dealer on Michigan Avenue during the 1 hour he'd had to himself the entire trip. The dealer had wound the key and played it for him right there on the counter. It was a delicate, slightly imperfect little melody, one of those old Italian folk tunes that his grandmother used to hum while she cooked. Not a lullaby exactly, something older than that, something that felt like it had been handed down instead of composed. Dante had bought it without negotiating the price. That alone should have told him something about where his head was. I was thinking about Nia. He'd been thinking about Nia for most of the 11 days, which wasn't unusual, but the particular texture of the thinking had shifted somewhere around day 7. It was less about wanting to get back to her. He always wanted that. And more about a low, persistent unease he couldn't name. Like a sound just below the frequency you can hear. Something his instincts were picking up that his conscious mind kept dismissing. She had sounded fine on the phone. She always sounded fine on the phone. But Dante had spent 16 years learning to read what people didn't say, and lately Nia's calls had a kind of careful quality to them. Measured. Like she was choosing each word after reviewing it first. He told himself it was pregnancy fatigue. He told himself it was the weight of those final weeks, the discomfort, the waiting. He told himself a lot of things. The SUV turned off the main road, and the lakefront estate came into view. The iron gate, the long gravel drive lined with security lights, the sprawling house that most people in Chicago didn't know existed, and the ones who did knew better than to approach uninvited. Dante had bought it 6 years ago. He'd renovated it with Nia in mind before he'd even proposed. Wide hallways, good natural light, a kitchen with enough counter space that 2 people could actually cook together instead of dancing around each other. He remembered watching her walk through it the first time, her hand trailing along the windowsills, and thinking that no property he'd ever acquired had felt worth anything until she was standing in it. Ren pulled to the front entrance and started to come around to open the door. Dante was already out. "I'll go in alone," he said. "Take the car to the east garage." Ren nodded without asking why. Another thing Dante valued. He had his own key. He rarely used it anymore. Someone was always expecting him, always at the door. But tonight he'd told no one he was coming early. Not his head of security, not his Captain Emilio, not even Marco, who had been with him since before the lakefront estate, before the empire had its current shape, back when Dante Viscari was still building instead of maintaining. He wanted to come home. Just come home. Walk through the door and find his wife, and not have 12 people standing at attention when he did it. He let himself in through the side entrance off the east garden. The house was quiet, in the way large houses get late in the evening, not empty, but settled. He could hear the distant sound of the television from the security room down the hall. He could smell something that might have been dinner, hours cooled. He had the music box in his right hand. I was going to find Nia wherever she was, the reading room probably, or the bedroom, and he was going to sit beside her and put the music box in her hands and wind the key and not say anything. He didn't have a speech prepared. He wasn't good at speeches with her. He was better at presence, at sitting close enough that she knew without words that whatever the 11 days had been, this was the part that mattered. He moved through the east corridor toward the main hall. That was when he heard his mother's voice, not the polished version Marcella Viscari deployed at family dinners or in rooms full of people she wanted to impress. This was the other voice, the one Dante had grown up hearing behind closed doors, the one that had a particular blade-sharp quality when Marcella had decided that someone in her orbit had stepped out of their proper position. He stopped walking. "I don't care how your back feels." Marcella's voice carried clearly through the half-open door of the kitchen corridor. "That's not my concern." Then silence. Then, "You think carrying his child gives you standing here? Let me explain something to you since nobody else seems willing to." Dante's grip tightened on the music box. He didn't move toward the door, not yet. Something made him stay still. Maybe the same instinct that had kept him alive in rooms where the danger wasn't visible, just present. He moved instead to a position in the shadow of the corridor where he could see without being seen. What he saw took 11 days of exhaustion and professional tension and compressed it into something entirely different. His mother stood in the center of the kitchen. Beside her was Greta, one of the household staff, holding a serving tray. Two of the younger soldiers, boys barely 20, both of whom answered to Silvio, were standing near the far wall, neither of them looking directly at anything. The posture of men who knew what was happening and had decided that not seeing it was safer than seeing it. Nia was standing near the kitchen island. She was wearing one of Dante's old sweatshirts, dark gray, too large for her even now, and her hair was pulled back with the kind of hasty practicality that meant she'd done it herself without caring about the result. She was 8 months along, and it showed in every line of her body, in the way she had one hand resting lightly on the counter and the other at her side, fingers slightly curled. In front of her, on the counter, was a bowl of soup. Just a bowl of soup. Marcella reached past her and slid it away. Nia looked at the bowl, then she looked at Marcella. She didn't say anything for a moment. Dante recognized that pause. It was the pause of someone who had done this calculation before. The one where you weigh what you want to say against what it will cost you to say it, and had learned through repetition which answer kept the peace. "I'll just go upstairs," Nia said. Her voice was even, controlled. "You'll do what I tell you," Marcella said. "There's a broken vase in the east hallway. Greta has been assigned to the guest rooms tonight. You can handle it." "She's 8 months pregnant," said a voice from the back of the room. It was Maria, the older housekeeper, the one who had worked the estate since before Dante purchased it, and who had, by Dante's standing order, been given authority over all domestic decisions while he traveled. Maria had a round, weathered face and a manner of speaking that suggested she had been arguing with difficult people since before most of the soldiers in this house were born. Marcella turned and looked at Maria with an expression that could have frozen the lake outside. "Was I speaking to you?" "No," Maria said. "I'm speaking to you. Mrs. Viscari asked for dinner 2 hours ago. She's been waiting. I prepared the soup at her request and you'll remove it," Marcella said, "or I'll have a conversation with my son about the staff arrangements in this house." Maria looked at the soup. She looked at Nia. Nia gave the smallest shake of her head, barely visible, the kind of gesture that says, "Please don't, not because I agree with this, but because I don't want to watch you get hurt for me." Maria stepped back. That small surrender, that tiny moment of someone who cared about Nia being forced to stand down, was the moment Dante realized how long this had been going on. Not days, weeks, maybe longer. He had always known his mother disapproved of Nia. Disapproval was Marcella Viscari's most natural condition. She disapproved of most things, most people, most situations that failed to meet her precise understanding of what the Viscari name required. Dante had factored this in. He'd had the conversation with her directly, twice, in the months after the wedding. He'd been firm. He'd believed she had accepted it, or at least accepted that he would not discuss it further. He had been an idiot. The cold clarity of that recognition moved through him without drama. He wasn't angry yet. Anger would come. Right now he was still in the observational mode that had kept him functional through 16 years in an industry where being wrong about people got you killed. Right now he was simply taking inventory. Marcella turned back to Nia. She clasped her hands in front of her in the precise way she always had when delivering information she considered to be obvious, and therefore not subject to debate. "Let me be direct with you," she said. "My son has obligations. To this family, to this organization, to a legacy that existed long before you arrived and will exist long after. You are here because Dante made a choice, but choices can be—" She paused, and the pause was itself a kind of cruelty. Reconsidered, especially when they produce complications. Nia looked at her for a long moment. Dante watched his wife's face and saw something move through it. Not fear, not defeat. Something older. The look of a person who has been told variations of this same thing so many times that they've had to find a way to carry it without letting it break them. "She's not a complication," Nia said quietly. "She's your granddaughter. She's the child of a woman who walked into this family with nothing and has spent 2 years failing to understand what that means." "I understand exactly what it means." Nia's voice didn't rise, it dropped. "It means I'm supposed to disappear. It means I'm supposed to be grateful for being invisible. I've been doing it. I've been doing it every time he leaves because I didn't want to put him in the middle of something he couldn't fix without hurting himself." She put a hand on her belly. The gesture was unconscious, protective. "I haven't asked you for anything. I'm asking you now for a bowl of soup." Marcella studied her for a moment. Then she said, in a voice so flat it was almost worse than contempt, "Clean the hallway first." Dante stepped through the door. He didn't announce himself. He didn't say anything. He simply walked in, and the change in the room was immediate and total. The 2 young soldiers straightened and then looked at the floor. Greta stepped back, and Maria's hand went to her mouth. Marcella turned at the sound of his footsteps. Her expression, for the first time in Dante's memory, showed something that might have been fear. He didn't look at her. He walked directly to Nia, who had gone very still, and he put himself between his wife and his mother, and he reached back and took Nia's hand without turning around. Nia's fingers curled around his immediately. They were cold. He turned and looked at Marcella. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. The people in this room, the soldiers, the staff, they had probably expected something dramatic. What they got instead was Dante Viscari in a voice so quiet and so completely without uncertainty that it was somehow more frightening than volume. "How long?" he said. Not a question. Not really. Marcella started to speak, something about misunderstandings, about his health, about the stress of the negotiations he'd just finished. He let her get through about 6 words before he held up one hand. She stopped. He said, "Not to me. I'm asking anyone in this room. How long?" No one answered. The silence itself answered. It had the weight of months in it, not days, months, and every person in that room knew it, and their silence confirmed it. Maria was crying quietly. Dante turned and looked at Nia for the first time since he'd walked in. Really looked at her. Not just her face, but her eyes, which were dry and steady and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with pregnancy. She'd been carrying this alone. She'd made the calculation and decided that protecting him from this was worth it. She'd chosen to absorb something that should never have touched her, because she loved him enough to protect him from a war inside his own house, while he was busy managing wars outside it. He let go of her hand just long enough to pick up the bowl of soup and put it back in front of her on the counter. "Sit down," he said gently. "Eat." Then he turned to face the room. His mother, the soldiers, the staff. And the man who stood in front of them now was not the man who had walked through the East Garden with a music box in his pocket and a quiet plan to sit beside his wife without saying anything important. "Everyone out," Dante said, "except you." He looked at his mother. "You stay." The room emptied in 30 seconds. Nia remained at the counter. She sat down on the kitchen stool and pulled the soup toward her, and she ate, slowly, while behind her. Dante and Marcella had the conversation that should have happened 2 years earlier. He didn't touch his mother. He didn't threaten her. Not with words she could point to later, not with anything that could be taken out of context. He simply told her, in the quiet and precise language he used for ending things permanently, exactly what was going to change. He told her what the consequences were. He told her that he was not asking. When he was finished, Marcella said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "You're making a mistake." Dante said, "It wouldn't be my first one." He sat down beside Nia and poured himself what was left of the soup from the pot on the stove. It was lukewarm. He ate it anyway. Nia looked at him and then looked back at her bowl. After a while she said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you." "Don't," he said. I know what you were trying to do." He set his spoon down. "That's the part I need to think about." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer right away. He was thinking about the music box still in his coat pocket, about the melody that was slightly imperfect, about the 11 days he'd been gone, and the versions of those 11 days that Nia had lived through inside these walls, while he was handling business that had, until 40 minutes ago, felt like the most important thing requiring his attention. "It means," he said finally, "that you shouldn't have had to protect me from my own house." She reached over and put her hand on his arm. Her fingers were warmer now. Outside the kitchen window, the lake was invisible in the dark, just the lights of the city reflecting off water that could have been any distance away. Dante sat with his wife and finished eating cold soup and thought about how many times he had walked out the front door in the past year, believing that the most dangerous threats to his family came from outside these walls. He had been wrong. The question now, the one that would keep him awake for the next several hours as Nia slept, and he sat in his study reviewing security logs he'd never thought to scrutinize, was how wrong, and for how long, and who else had known. He was about to find out that the answer to all three of those questions was considerably worse than anything he had walked home expecting to discover. The music box sat on the kitchen counter, wound but not yet played. Waiting. Dante didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study on the second floor with the door locked and his jacket still on, and a glass of water he hadn't touched sitting on the desk beside him. The room smelled like old paper and the faint residue of cigarettes from years ago, before Nia had asked him to stop smoking inside, and he had, without argument, because some requests don't require negotiation. He hadn't smoked in the house since. He was thinking about all the things he'd accepted without verifying. That was what kept him in the chair while the clock on the wall moved from 11 to midnight to 1 in the morning. Not rage. Rage was easy. Rage had a direction and a momentum, and you could ride it through to the other side. This was something slower and more corrosive. This was the recognition that he had built an entire system for detecting threats, and had applied exactly none of it to the place where the people he loved most actually lived. He opened the security archive on his desktop. The estate had cameras on every exterior entry point and in the main corridors. That had always been the arrangement. Interior rooms, the bedrooms, the kitchen, the private sitting rooms, were deliberately uncovered. Dante had made that decision himself years ago because he believed there was a line between security and surveillance, and he didn't want to live on the wrong side of it inside his own home. Now he sat looking at the exterior and corridor footage from the past 3 months, and understood that the line he'd drawn for privacy had also drawn a convenient blind spot for anyone who knew how to use it. He started with the corridor outside the kitchen. He found what he was looking for in less than 20 minutes, which told him something. Not buried, not carefully hidden, just there, in the footage, available to anyone who thought to look, which apparently no one had, because no one had thought it was worth looking for. 14 separate incidents in 11 weeks. Marcella, twice with Silvio present, 4 times with just household staff around her, 8 times in various configurations. Always when Dante was away, always in rooms where Nia had no easy exit. The interactions were brief, 5 minutes, 8 minutes, once just over 12. Too short to look like confrontations. Long enough to be deliberate. He watched Nia's body language across those 14 clips and felt something in his chest that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite anger but occupied the same space as both. She held herself the same way every time, shoulders slightly forward, one hand near her belly, head up, eyes direct, because Nia Whitmore had never been someone who looked at the floor when she was frightened. She looked at the thing frightening her, which was either courage or stubbornness, and Dante had always thought it was probably both. But underneath that, in the set of her jaw, in the way her weight shifted backward toward the nearest wall, he could see it now. The physical vocabulary of someone managing a situation they were too tired of to fight directly. He'd missed it for 11 weeks. He pulled up the phone records next. The estate used an internal system for household communications, separate from personal cell networks, and Dante had administrative access that he had not exercised in years because he had never felt the need to. He felt the need now. The records showed that Nia's calls during his absences, calls placed from the main house line, calls that should have connected to his secure mobile, had been routed through a secondary relay point that added approximately 4 seconds of delay, and more relevantly, passed through a monitoring node that Dante did not authorize and had not known existed. He stared at that for a long time. Someone had modified the estate's internal communication system, not crudely, not in a way that would show up as an obvious intrusion, carefully, with the kind of technical patience that required either expertise or the direction of someone with expertise, and either way it required access to the system's administrative architecture. The number of people with that level of access to the estate's infrastructure was not large. He picked up his phone and called Emilio. Emilio Caras had been Dante's head of household security for 7 years. He was 51 years old, built like something quarried rather than born, and he had the particular quality of absolute loyalty that Dante had learned to distinguish from performed loyalty through years of needing to know the difference. When Emilio answered on the second ring, his voice had the immediate alertness of a man who had been asleep but woke without confusion. "Boss? Come to the study, alone." A pause. Short. 5 minutes. It was 4. Emilio came through the door and took one look at Dante's face and the open security archive on the screen and pulled the chair from the far wall over to the desk without being invited and sat down. "Tell me about the relay node in the internal comm system," Dante said. Emilio's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough. "When did you find it?" Dante said. Not a question. Emilio put both hands flat on the desk. 6 weeks ago. The silence that followed had a particular density. 6 weeks, Dante said. I reported it to Silvio. He told me it was a new security protocol he'd implemented on your authorization. He said you'd approved a communication audit system during the... I didn't authorize anything. I know that now. You knew it then. Emilio's face didn't change, but something behind it did. I had documentation, a signed memo. I cross-referenced it against your communication schedule, and it... He stopped, started again. It looked legitimate. I've been in this work long enough to know what legitimate looks like, and it looked like that. I'm telling you, Dante, it looked like that. Dante studied him. Emilio was not a man who made excuses. When he was wrong, he said he was wrong and moved on. The fact that he was explaining rather than simply accepting told Dante that whatever Emilio had seen 6 weeks ago had been genuinely convincing. Show me the memo, Dante said. Emilio had it on his phone. He'd kept it. Of course he'd kept it. Emilio kept everything, which was part of why he was good at his job. He put the phone on the desk and Dante looked at the document on the screen. The signature was Dante's. The format was correct. The letterhead was correct. Even the specific phrasing, the particular combination of clipped directives and precise operational language that Dante used for internal memos, was correct. Someone had studied how he wrote and reproduced it accurately enough to fool a man who had worked for him for 7 years. Who else has seen this? Dante said. No one. I kept it between me and Silvio. And Silvio told you not to mention it to me. He said you preferred to be briefed in person, that you'd go over it when you returned from... Emilio stopped. His expression shifted into something grimmer. He said you'd go over it when you returned from the North Side negotiations, which he knew the timeline for. Yes. Dante stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, the security lights along the drive were steady. The estate looked exactly as it always did at 1 a.m, guarded and quiet and sealed against the outside world. The outside world had never been the problem. How many of the estate staff report directly to Silvio? Dante said. Formally? None. He has no household authority. Informally? Emilio was quiet for a moment. The two boys in the East Wing, Ferrar and Luca, they came in through his recommendation 8 months ago. I vetted their backgrounds, but a pause. He recommended them. 8 months ago, right around the time Nia's pregnancy had become visible, right around the time Marcella's visits to the estate had increased from occasional to regular. Dante turned from the window. Wake Marco. Tell him to meet me in the lower conference room in 30 minutes. Tell him nothing else. Tell no one else. And Silvio? Don't touch Silvio. Don't contact him. Don't let him know I'm back early. If he doesn't know yet, I want it to stay that way for as long as possible. Emilio stood. He was halfway to the door when Dante said his name. He turned. The document, Dante said. The memo with my signature. Who had the capability to produce that? Emilio considered it, not rushing to an answer which Dante appreciated. Someone who's seen enough of your written communications to replicate the style. Someone with access to the estate letterhead template. That's in the administrative server. He paused. And someone who understood the security architecture well enough to know the relay node would hold up to a standard verification check. That's a short list. Yes, Emilio said. It is. He left. Dante stood in the study alone for a moment. He picked up the glass of water and drank half of it. Then he went down the hall and opened the bedroom door quietly and stood in the doorway looking at Nia, who was asleep on her side with one pillow between her knees and the small lamp on the nightstand still on, because she'd always been someone who fell asleep reading and never remembered to turn the light off. She looked exhausted, even asleep. Not the normal exhaustion of late pregnancy. He'd watched that develop over months, the way it softened her face and slowed her movements, and that was its own thing. This was different. This was the exhaustion of sustained vigilance finally released, of a body and mind that had been holding tension for weeks and had only just been given permission to set it down. He stood there for probably 2 minutes. He didn't go in. He didn't wake her. He pulled the door mostly closed and went back down the hall and down the stairs. Marco was already in the lower conference room when Dante arrived, which was either impressive or suspicious. And Marco seemed to read that calculation on Dante's face because the first thing he said when Dante walked in was, I was awake. I don't sleep well when you're traveling. Never have. Marco Rinaldi was 57 years old and had been Dante's most senior captain for the past 9 years. Before that, he'd worked with Dante's father, which gave him an institutional memory that extended back further than almost anyone else still alive in the organization. But was not a large man, compact, deliberate, with a face that had settled into permanent watchfulness. The kind of face that gave nothing away because it had decided long ago that giving things away was a liability. He sat across the table from Dante with his hands folded and waited. Dante laid it out. All of it. The security footage, the relay node, the forged memo, Emilio's account, the timeline. He spoke without editorializing, just facts in sequence, the same way he would have briefed his own people about a threat assessment. Marco listened without interrupting, which was unusual. Marco usually had questions. The fact that he was holding them told Dante that Marco was listening to more than the facts. He was listening for what the facts added up to. When Dante finished, Marco unfolded his hands and put them flat on the table. How long have you suspected something was off? Marco said. Tonight. Marco looked at him. Tonight is when you confirmed it. I'm asking when your gut told you something was wrong. Dante considered that. 7, 8 days ago, during the Northside meeting, Silvio sent me an updated position on the Marchetti negotiation. The numbers were off. Not wrong enough to call out, off enough that I noticed, and then let it go because I had 14 other things in front of me. The numbers were off, Marco repeated, or the numbers had been altered. Dante said nothing, because Marco was right, and they both knew it. Marco stood up and walked to the far end of the room, which was what he did when he was thinking through something uncomfortable. He had a habit of physically separating himself from whoever he was talking to when the content of the conversation required him to say something he would rather not say. Silvio has been running money through the Marchetti account, Marco said, facing the far wall. I've been seeing irregularities for about 4 months. I raised it with him directly because I thought it was a bookkeeping error. He gave me a correction memo, said it was a legitimate reallocation you'd approved verbally during the Bridgeport meetings in the summer. Dante felt the temperature in the room drop by several degrees. And you accepted that. Marco turned around. His face was flat, but his eyes were not. I accepted it because you'd been traveling extensively and verbal authorizations without paper trail aren't unusual when you're in the middle of an active negotiation, and because he stopped. His jaw moved. Because it was Silvio. He's your cousin, Dante. He's been your underboss for 4 years. The idea that... Another stop. I should have pushed harder. Yes, Dante said. You should have. The words landed and Marco absorbed them without flinching, which was one of the things about Marco that Dante had always relied on. The man could take a hit without collapsing and without fighting back, because he understood the difference between accountability and attack. How much? Dante said. I'd need to pull the full account records, but my estimate, conservatively, is somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 over 18 months. The number was large enough to be significant and small enough to have been designed that way, kept below the threshold where automatic oversight mechanisms would have flagged it. Patient, methodical. Dante put both hands on the table and looked at them. They were steady. He was grateful for that. There's something else, Marco said. His voice had changed. Not dramatically, just a shift in register, the way a man's voice changes when he moves from difficult territory into territory that is actively dangerous. Dante looked up. 3 weeks ago, I was approached by a man I know peripherally. He works adjacent to the Calumet operation. Not directly connected, but close enough to have reliable information. He told me, and I want to be clear that I didn't bring this to you immediately because I was trying to verify it independently before I did. He told me that there was movement inside the organization, not from outside, from inside. He said someone was building a parallel structure, consolidating loyalty among the younger crews, positioning for... Marco stopped and looked directly at Dante. For a leadership transition. The room was very quiet. He used those words, Dante said. Leadership transition. Yes. And you've been sitting on this for 3 weeks. I've been trying to verify it. I didn't want to bring you unconfirmed intelligence about a potential internal coup while you were in the middle of the North Side negotiation. The timing was exactly when someone wanted you to think you should wait, Dante said. Marco absorbed that. He absorbed it the way a man absorbs a diagnosis, with the stillness of someone who already knew and was waiting for confirmation. The relay node on the communication system, Dante said. Silvio monitoring Nia's calls, the forged authorization memo, the financial irregularities, the parallel loyalty structure. He paused. This isn't opportunism. This has been planned. Yes, Marco said quietly. That's what I was afraid you'd conclude. Dante stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Marco with an expression that was not anger. Anger had passed through him earlier and left behind something colder and more operational, the specific mental state that had allowed him to function in 16 years of work that regularly required him to make decisions that other men couldn't make. I need you to pull the full financial records from the Marchetti account tonight. I need complete personnel files on Ferrar and Luca. I need a list. Your honest assessment, Marco. Not what you want to be true, but what you actually believe. Of every captain and crew leader whose loyalty you are not certain of. Marco nodded. And I need you to do all of it without contacting Silvio, without anyone in Silvio's circle knowing what we're doing, and without... Dante paused. Without waking anyone in the East Wing. Marco understood. Ferrar and Luca were in the East Wing. He started toward the door. Marco. He stopped. The man who approached you 3 weeks ago, the one who told you about the leadership transition. Dante looked at him steadily. Where is he now? Marco was quiet for a moment. I don't know. I tried to reach him again 5 days ago to verify the information, and he didn't respond. Dante said nothing. Marco said, That worries me too. He left. Dante stood alone in the lower conference room, which had no windows. It was below grade, designed that way deliberately, insulated from the outside in every sense. He was underground in his own house at 2 a.m, with the growing certainty that the man who sat at his right hand, who attended every strategy meeting, who had access to financial accounts and communication systems and personnel records and the daily schedule of everyone inside this estate, had been methodically building the architecture of his destruction for somewhere between 12 and 18 months. The question that kept returning, turning over like something caught in a current, was not how or when or even why. Those answers were assembling themselves with the horrible clarity of a picture coming into focus. The question was what Silvio had planned to do with Nia, with his unborn child. Once Dante was gone, he thought about the way his cousin had, over the past year, repeatedly raised concerns about Nia's need for privacy during Dante's absences. He thought about the specific phrasing Silvio had used. She needs space. She told me she finds the staff attention overwhelming. She asked me specifically to... She had never said any of those things. Dante knew that now with complete certainty. Nia hadn't asked for isolation. She'd been engineered into it, slowly, incrementally, in a way that looked like consideration and was actually containment. A pregnant woman, isolated, in a house where the staff had been quietly repositioned toward loyalty to the man who would take over after the funeral. Not a widow. A symbol. That was what Silvio had been building toward. Nia and the child as a claim to legitimacy, as evidence that the transition was natural rather than violent, as a human argument for why the organization should accept the new order. The child would be born into a house that belonged to someone else. Dante moved through that recognition and came out the other side of it in a place that was entirely without ambiguity. I was halfway up the stairs when he heard the noise from the east wing. It was not loud. A door. A quick, muffled exchange of voices, one of them familiar and one of them on a phone. And then silence again. The kind of silence that follows a conversation someone realized they were having too loudly. Dante stopped on the stairs. He stood perfectly still and listened and calculated, and in 12 seconds understood three things simultaneously: that Silvio had been informed of his early return, that the window for controlled disclosure was now closed, and that everything that happened next was going to happen faster than he had planned for. He pulled out his phone and sent Emilio a single word. The word was, now. Then he continued up the stairs at a pace that was unhurried and deliberate and absolutely final, because there was no longer any version of this night in which he got to choose the timing. Someone had just made that choice for him. Emilio moved fast. By the time Dante reached the top of the stairs, he could already hear the controlled sounds of men repositioning through the house. Not running, not loud, but purposeful in the way that people who have trained for urgency move when urgency actually arrives. Doors closing. Footsteps on the service stairs. The particular silence that follows a radio exchange done in abbreviated code. Dante walked down the east corridor toward the wing where Ferrar and Luca had their rooms. He walked at a normal pace. He'd learned a long time ago that how you move through a space tells everyone watching you how frightened you are, and he had no intention of letting anyone in this house read that particular information off his body tonight. Emilio met him at the junction of the east corridor and the main hall. "They're both in their rooms," Emilio said quietly. "Ferrar's light is on. Luca's is dark, but I've got a man on the exterior." "Which one made the call?" "Ferrar. I pulled the internal log. He used the house landline at 247. The outgoing number?" Emilio held out his phone so Dante could see the screen. "It's one of Silvio's secondary lines, the one he uses for operational communication." Dante looked at the number and handed the phone back. "Silvio knows I'm here." "Yes." "How much of a head start does he have?" Emilio's expression answered before his words did. "Enough to be a problem." Dante stood at the corridor junction for 4 seconds. He counted them. 4 seconds of genuine stillness in which he sorted through options the way he'd learned to sort through them. Not by preference, not by what felt right, but by what the situation actually allowed. "Bring Ferrar to the lower conference room. Don't use force unless he gives you a reason. Tell him I want to talk. Make it sound routine. And if he runs?" "He won't." Dante paused. He's 22 years old, and he just realized he's inside a locked estate at 3 in the morning with the man he called to warn against. He's not going to run. He's going to try to explain himself, which is exactly what I need him to do. He was right. Ferrar came to the lower conference room voluntarily, which told Dante that the young man was either very confident in his cover story or very poorly prepared for the alternative. When he sat down across the table, his face had the specific arrangement of a person trying to look like they had nothing to hide while hiding something, which is one of the more recognizable faces a human being can make. He was 22, dark hair, slight build, the kind of young man who looked younger than he was, and had probably spent his whole life using that to his advantage in rooms where people underestimated him. Dante sat across from him and didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at him. The silence was deliberate. Silence was a pressure system. and Dante had been applying it to people for 16 years. Farrar lasted about 40 seconds. "I was just checking in," he said. "Mr. Silvio asked me to keep him informed about the household schedule when—" "Who asked you to modify the communication relay?" Dante said. Farrar's mouth stopped moving. "The node on the internal system," Dante said. "The one that routes outgoing calls from the main house line through a secondary monitoring point. Who asked you to install it?" The young man's eyes moved left. A small, involuntary movement. The eyes of someone whose brain just shifted from the story it had prepared to the uncomfortable terrain of improvisation. "I don't know what you're—" "Farrar." Dante's voice didn't change volume or tone. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. In approximately 4 hours, I'm going to have a complete picture of everything that has happened in this house for the past 12 months. That picture is being assembled right now, in this building, by people I trust entirely. When it's finished, the only question that will matter to me is who understood what they were participating in and who was used without full knowledge." He paused. "Those two categories are going to be treated very differently. You have about 3 minutes to decide which one you'd like to be in." Farrar looked at the table. His jaw was working. Not chewing, just the unconscious movement of a jaw under stress, grinding slightly. "He said it was a security measure," Farrar said finally. His voice had changed. The performance had dropped out of it, and what was underneath was young and tired and frightened. "He said Mr. Vescry approved it, that it was to protect Mrs. Vescry's privacy, that there had been concerns about the calls being intercepted from outside, and this was a precaution. And you believe that. He's the underboss." Farrar looked up. "You don't question the underboss?" "No," Dante said. "You don't." A pause. "What else did he ask you to do?" The next 40 minutes were not pleasant. Not for Farrar, who had to navigate the specific misery of confessing incrementally, each piece pulled out by the weight of the one before it. Not for Dante, who sat across from him and listened with complete stillness while the interior of his organization came apart in real time. Farrar had been monitoring Nia's movements inside the estate. Not her conversations, he didn't have audio in the interior rooms, but her daily patterns. When she slept, when she ate, when she went to the reading room or the garden. Timed records, delivered to Silvio weekly through a dead drop that used the estate's internal mail system in a way that would look, on any log, like routine interoffice correspondence. Silvio had known, for months, the daily rhythms of Dante's pregnant wife. The purpose of that information, stated baldly, was to ensure that Marcella's visits to the estate coincided with times when Nia was isolated, when staff presence was minimal, when the household was arranged in a way that maximized her exposure and minimized witnesses inclined to intervene. It had not been random cruelty. It had been scheduled. Dante sat with that for a moment. The music box was still upstairs on the kitchen counter where he'd left it. He thought about it briefly and then put the thought away. "The call you made tonight," Dante said. "What exactly did you tell Silvio?" "That you were back. That you'd been in the kitchen with Mrs. Vescry and your mother. That you'd cleared the room and sent for Emilio." Farrar paused. "He already knew about the confrontation before I called. Someone had already—" He stopped. "Someone had already called him," Dante said. Farrar nodded. "From inside the house." Another nod. Dante looked at Emilio, who was standing near the door. Emilio's expression had shifted into something that Dante recognized as controlled fury. Not at Farrar, at himself, at the months of oversight this represented. "Get me the complete outgoing call log from every line in the house for the past 6 hours," Dante said to Emilio. Then, to Farrar, "You're going to stay in this room. Someone will bring you water. You don't use any communication device. You don't contact anyone. When this is over, I will decide what happens to you based on whether what you've told me tonight checks out." Farrar nodded. His shoulders had collapsed inward. He looked like what he was, a young man who had walked into something much larger than he'd understood and was now sitting in the wreckage of that miscalculation. Dante left the room. In the hallway, he stopped and stood with his back against the wall and took 3 slow breaths. Not for composure. He was composed, which was its own kind of problem, because the composure was costing him something and he could feel the cost accumulating. But because the next several hours required him to think with the precision of someone who had not been awake for 22 hours and had not just sat across from a young man and heard, in careful detail, how his pregnant wife had been monitored positioned, and used as a component in someone else's architecture. He needed to think about Silvio. Not about what Silvio had done, that was clear enough. About what Silvio would do now that he knew Dante was back and aware. Silvio was smart. That was the first relevant fact. Dante had valued that about him for years. The ability to anticipate, to see several moves ahead, to understand that most situations have more dimensions than they appear to. He had promoted him to underboss partly on the strength of that quality. That same quality was now operating against him. Silvio knew the estate. He knew its security layout, its entry and exit points, the patrol patterns, the staff arrangements. He had spent 4 years as underboss attending to the operational details of Dante's life, which meant he had an accurate map of exactly how the estate functioned and where its vulnerabilities were. He also knew that Dante's first instinct, when the house was locked down, would be to focus inward, to secure Nia, secure the perimeter, pull information from the people inside, which meant Silvio's response would come from outside. Dante pushed off the wall and walked quickly to the security room. The security room was at the north end of the ground floor, behind a door that required both a key code and a physical key. Inside were 8 monitors displaying feeds from the exterior cameras, a communications console, and the server rack that housed the estate's entire digital infrastructure. 2 of Emilio's men were stationed there around the clock in rotating shifts. When Dante walked in, both men straightened. "Pull up the northeast perimeter," Dante said. "From the past 40 minutes. The camera feed came up on the center monitor. The northeast perimeter covered the tree line along the edge of the estate's outer grounds, the furthest point from the main buildings, partially obscured by mature oaks that the previous owner had planted along the property line decades ago." At 2:51 a.m., 4 minutes after Ferrar's call to Silvio, a vehicle had stopped on the service road that ran adjacent to the northeast boundary. It sat for approximately 90 seconds. Then it moved on. 90 seconds was enough time to drop someone off. "How many men do we have on exterior patrol right now?" Dante said. 6, said the guard on his left. "Standard overnight rotation." "Where are they positioned?" The guard pulled up the patrol map. Dante looked at the positions and felt the specific internal sensation of someone who has just seen a pattern and does not like what it means. The standard overnight rotation, which Silvio had helped design 2 years ago during a security review, left the northeast perimeter with a coverage gap of approximately 11 minutes between patrol passes. Dante had reviewed and approved that rotation. He'd approved it because at the time it had seemed like a reasonable allocation of resources for an estate that faced external threats from the south and west, the directions where rival operations and city infrastructure created the most exposure. The northeast was trees and lake and private road. Low risk. Silvio had known that when he designed it. "Get everyone inside," Dante said. "Now, full interior lockdown. I want the exterior gates sealed, and I want 2 men on every interior access point in this building." The guard reached for the radio. He'd barely keyed it when the power went out. Not a flicker. Complete. Every monitor, every overhead light, the console displays, all of it gone in the same instant, replaced by the red emergency lighting that clicked on automatically from battery backup. The monitors came back on partial power after 6 seconds, but the communications console stayed dark. Someone had cut the primary power feed from outside, which meant they'd known where it ran. Not a guess, not a lucky cut. Someone had gone directly to the junction box on the northeast boundary line and killed it with specific knowledge of its location. That knowledge existed in the estate's infrastructure files, which Silvio had access to. Dante turned to the guard on his right. "Tell me you have a backup radio." "Yes." The man was already reaching for it. "Tell me it's on a separate frequency from the primary system." A pause. "It's on the secondary protocol. Same hardware infrastructure, different..." Another pause. Longer. The man's face in the red emergency light was not reassuring. "The secondary protocol runs through the main relay hub. The same hub that was currently sitting dark because the power to the console was out." Dante said, with the very particular quietness of a man choosing not to do the thing his instincts wanted him to do in that moment. "Give me the backup radio anyway." He keyed it. Static. He tried 3 different frequencies. Static on all of them. They were jammed. Not blacked out by the power failure. That would have been clean silence. This was active interference, a signal layered over the communication channels, which required a device. which required someone close enough to the estate to project that signal effectively. 90 seconds. Parked on the service road. Not dropping someone off. Dropping equipment off. Dante was already moving out of the security room before he finished the thought. He grabbed one of the guards, the larger one, a man named Cass, who he'd seen operate under pressure before, and pointed at the stairs. Bedroom, 3rd floor. Don't leave that door. Cass moved without question. Dante went in a different direction. He took the servants' stairs, which ran along the interior of the east wall and were narrower than the main staircase but faster, and he went up 2 floors, not to the bedroom but to the study, where he kept, in the false bottom of the second desk drawer, beneath a layer of documents that looked like financial records and were actually just paper, a phone that was not connected to the estate's internal system, not connected to any network associated with his name, registered to an identity that had no relationship to Dante Viscari and that he had maintained for years purely for the situations in which every other system failed. He unlocked the drawer, removed the phone, and turned it on. It took 40 seconds to connect to signal. 40 seconds in which he stood in the dark study, the emergency lighting didn't reach this room, and listened to the house around him and tried to determine from sound alone what was happening on floors he couldn't see. He heard nothing, which, in a house that should have contained multiple people moving rapidly in response to a lockdown, was wrong. The phone connected. He called Marco. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called Emilio. 2 rings. Then a sound that was not Emilio's voice, a brief scuffle, something hard hitting something else. And then silence, and then a voice Dante had known for his entire adult life said, "Cousin." Dante stood very still. Silvio's voice on the other end of the line was measured, careful. The voice of a man who had prepared for this exact moment and was determined to perform it correctly. "I think we should talk. I think this has gone further than either of us intended, and I think—" "Where is Emilio?" Dante said. "He's fine. He's going to stay fine as long as you and I have a reasonable conversation." "Where are you?" "Close." A pause. "I've been close for a while, Dante. That's sort of the point." Dante's hand on the phone was steady. Every other part of him had narrowed to a point. Not anger, not fear, something that existed beyond both of those, the state that he'd accessed a handful of times in 16 years when the situation had removed every option except the most direct one. "What do you want?" Dante said. "What I've always wanted." Silvio's voice shifted, just slightly, just enough to let something underneath the measured calm show through, something that had been waiting a long time. "For you to see that you've been running this organization wrong for years. You have the reputation, Dante. You have the history, but you've been distracted. You've been—" A pause, and in the pause Dante could hear him choosing the word domesticated. And an organization like ours can't survive a leader who's been domesticated. This is about the organization. This is about everything. The organization, the family, the future. You brought a woman into this house who has no understanding of what we are. You've been softening. The captains see it. The crews see it. I've been managing the fallout from my what? Dante's voice was flat. From your choices. Silvio said it with a kind of finality. I'm not the villain here. I'm the one who kept things functional while you were busy playing at something you can't afford to be. Dante listened to the speech. He let it finish. He understood that Silvio needed to deliver it, had probably rehearsed versions of it, had probably told himself versions of it so many times in the past 18 months that he had begun to believe the framing. You monitored my wife, Dante said. You arranged for her to be isolated. You had her humiliated in her own home while she was 8 months pregnant. You forged my signature and stole from my accounts, and you built a parallel loyalty structure designed to replace me. A pause. And you arranged for someone to kill me. Silence on the line. Dante said, Don't. Whatever you're about to say, don't. The situation required you to come to me. Dante's voice finally moved. Not loud, but no longer flat. Something underneath it now. Something that had been banked for the past several hours and was no longer fully contained. If you believed what you're saying, Fionn, if you genuinely believed I was failing this organization, you come to me. You sit down across from me and you tell me. That's what you do. That's what loyalty means. That's the only thing it's ever meant. Silvio said nothing. Instead, you went into my house, Dante said. You went into my house and you used my mother, and you used my wife, and you used my unborn child as pieces in something you built behind my back. And now you're on my phone telling me you're not the villain. A long pause. I have 12 men in the building, Silvio said. His voice had changed. The rehearsed quality was gone. What was underneath it was colder and less controlled. I have Emilio. I have the communications locked. I have... You don't have my wife, Dante said. Another pause, longer this time. She's upstairs, Silvio said. She's not upstairs. The silence that followed that had a different texture than the ones before it. This was the silence of someone whose mental map has just been told it's wrong. Dante had sent Cass to the bedroom 20 minutes ago with one instruction: get Nia out of the bedroom and into the secondary safe room on the third floor, which Silvio knew existed but whose access panel was behind a section of wall that had been added during the last renovation. A renovation whose plans Silvio had never seen because Dante had commissioned it through a separate contractor and kept the documentation out of the estate's main files. One thing. In 4 years of Silvio's careful, patient accumulation of knowledge about this house, there was one thing he had never been given access to. Dante had not known, when he made that decision, that he was making it for this reason. He'd made it because he was private and because some things in a house should belong only to the people who live in it. Sometimes the things you protect without knowing why are the things that end up mattering most. You need to think carefully about the next thing you do, Dante said into the phone. I have 12, and I have this building, Dante said. I know where every wall is. I know where every door goes. I know which floorboards creak and which stairwells echo, and which corridor puts a man in a position where he can't see the junction behind him. You've spent 18 months studying how I operate from the outside. I've spent 6 years living inside these walls. A pause. Come find me, Silvio. Or send your 12 men to do it. Either way, by the time morning comes, you're going to need to explain to everyone in this organization why you failed at the one thing you had every possible advantage at. He ended the call. He stood in the dark study for exactly 3 seconds. Then he moved. He went to the window, not to look out, but to the panel beside it, which controlled the interior room lighting through a manual override that ran off a separate low-voltage circuit unconnected to the main power grid. He'd had it installed after a storm 2 years ago had taken out the estate's power for 11 hours. Nia had joked that he was being paranoid. He had said he preferred to be able to see in his own house regardless of what was happening outside it. He brought up the emergency lighting in the study and the 3 connecting rooms on the east side of the 3rd floor, leaving the main corridors dark. Then he went to the secondary safe room and knocked twice, paused, knocked once more. The panel opened from inside. Cass was standing in the narrow entrance with the expression of a man who has been doing exactly what he was told and waiting for further instructions. Behind him, sitting on the small bench that lined the interior wall, was Nia. She was wearing the same dark gray sweatshirt. Her hair was still pulled back. She had one hand on her belly, and she was looking at Dante with an expression that was frightened and awake and completely, stubbornly present. How many? She said. Not, what's happening. Not, are you okay? How many? 8 months of living inside a situation she hadn't chosen and absorbing more about how this world functioned than Dante had ever intended her to absorb. 12 that I know of, he said. She nodded. Emilio? Silvio has him. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. The backup comm? Jammed. She looked at him for a moment, then she said very quietly, You have a plan. It wasn't quite a question, but it needed an answer. Dante looked at his wife in the red emergency light of the safe room she hadn't known existed until 20 minutes ago, with 12 men somewhere in his house and his most trusted security captain in his cousin's hands, and every communication system compromised. And he said, I have the beginning of one. Her jaw tightened. She looked like she wanted to say something and was choosing not to because she understood. Because she had always understood the moments when adding words to a situation made it worse rather than better. Then from somewhere below them in the house came the sound that ended the last of the planning time. A single gunshot. Then 2 more in quick succession. Then voices, loud and urgent, and the sound of boots on the main staircase moving fast. Silvio had stopped waiting. The first shot had come from the 2nd floor. Dante knew that from the acoustics, the way sound traveled through the estate's interior walls, the specific reverb of a gunshot in the main corridor versus the stairwell versus one of the side rooms. 6 years of living in a building teaches you its voice in ways you don't consciously register until you need the information. He needed it now. 2 more shots. Closer together. Same floor, east side, near the junction of the main hall and the corridor that led to the guest wing. Not a firefight, no return fire, no overlapping sound, one weapon, one direction. Which meant either his people were already neutralized in that section of the building, or someone had fired as a signal, not at a target but at a ceiling, at a wall, at the air. To start the clock, to force Dante out of whatever position he'd taken and into motion. Silvio understood pressure. He'd watched Dante respond to it for years. Dante closed the safe room panel from the outside. He looked at Cass. "Nobody opens that from outside except me," he said. "You understand what I mean by that?" Cass understood. His face said he understood completely. "Yes, sir." Dante moved. He went down the third-floor corridor away from the main stairwell toward the north end of the building where a secondary access, a maintenance door that opened onto a service staircase used for laundry and supply runs, connected all 3 floors without passing through any of the main traffic areas. Silvio's people would be covering the primary staircase and probably the main landing. They would not know about the service stairs unless they'd done a physical survey of the building in the past several weeks. And if they'd managed that without Emilio or any of the regular staff noticing, Dante would have heard about it. He hadn't heard about it. He moved through the service stairs fast and quiet, one hand against the wall in the near darkness, his body oriented sideways on the narrow steps out of habit. Sideways presented less of a target on a staircase, reduced the silhouette, and he'd had that particular habit for so long it happened before he thought about it. 2nd floor. He stopped at the service door and listened. Voices. 2 of them. Close. 12, 15 feet on the other side of the door. Speaking low. He couldn't make out words, but he could hear the rhythm of it. The tight, alert exchange of 2 people maintaining a position rather than moving through the space. Holding the corridor junction. He did not open the door. He continued down to the 1st floor. The service door at the ground level opened into the kitchen corridor. The same corridor where, less than 4 hours ago, he had walked through and seen his mother take a bowl of soup away from his pregnant wife. The corridor was empty now. The kitchen emergency lighting threw everything in dim red, making the familiar space look like somewhere he'd never been. He moved through the kitchen toward the main hall. He heard Emilio before he saw him. Not words. A sound, sharp and involuntary, the specific sound a person makes when something causes sudden pain, coming from the formal dining room off the main hall, whose double doors were standing partially open. Dante stopped at the edge of the doorway and looked through the gap. The dining room had been reconfigured. The long table had been pushed to one side, and 4 of Silvio's men were positioned at different points in the room with a deliberateness that said they'd been placed there, not that they'd drifted there naturally. 2 near the far wall, 1 at the door to the butler's pantry, 1 standing directly in front of Emilio, who was seated in one of the dining chairs with his wrists zip-tied to the armrests. Emilio had a cut above his left eye that was bleeding freely, dark in the emergency lighting. He was conscious, breathing through his nose, jaw set. He was looking at the man standing in front of him with an expression that had nothing yielding in it. The man standing in front of him was not Silvio. He was 40 or so, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that suggested it had been rearranged more than once over the years. Dante didn't know him. He filed that, a man in his house that he didn't recognize, which meant Silvio had brought in outside support. Not just the younger crew members who owed him loyalty within the organization. Someone from further out. That changed the calculation. Someone you bring in from outside doesn't have the same hesitations as someone whose career exists inside the same structure. An outside man doesn't worry about reputation within the organization or relationships that survive the night. An outside man does what he's paid to do and walks away from the rest. 4 men visible. Emilio secured. The 2 upstairs on the corridor junction. That was 6 accounted for. Silvio had said 12. Dante pulled back from the doorway. He needed a phone that worked. He needed to reach Marco, who had last been in the lower conference room pulling financial records, and who had either gone to ground during the incursion or had been found. He needed to know how many exits were being covered, and by how many men, and whether any of his people were still free and mobile in the building. He needed about 45 minutes, and he had approximately none. He also needed a weapon, which was a more solvable problem than it appeared, because the kitchen had a utility drawer near the second prep station where one of his regular security staff, a 20-year veteran named Boots, who had worked this house since before Dante bought it, and who had opinions about preparedness that bordered on the philosophical, had, for the entire 6 years of Dante's residence, kept a compact semi-automatic in a magnetic holster on the interior wall of the drawer, loaded, safety on, behind a layer of dish towels. Dante had never asked him to do this. Boots had done it on his own initiative and had mentioned it once, casually, in a way that made clear he expected Dante to tell him to remove it if he objected. Dante had not objected. He'd never thought about it again. He thought about it now. He moved back into the kitchen, opened the second drawer, found the dish towels, found the holster, and pulled the weapon free. Compact, loaded, safety on. Exactly as promised. Boots had been with the estate's exterior patrol team tonight, which meant he was either locked down on the grounds or had been neutralized in the initial incursion. Either way, Dante hoped he was alive and intended to tell him, when this was over, that the dish towel arrangement had been one of the better ideas anyone had ever had in this kitchen. He checked the weapon, chambered. 9 rounds. Then he heard Silvio's voice, not through a wall, not through a door, from somewhere close, 10-12 feet, around the corner of the kitchen corridor where it connected to the back passage leading to the main hall. Clear enough that Dante could hear individual words. Not the point. The point is he's moving, which means he's not with her. Find the wife. A pause. Someone responding through a radio or phone. Dante couldn't hear the other side. The 3rd floor is locked down. Silvio's voice, impatient. The safe room that Cass mentioned. It's not on any of the building plans I have. Someone gave him that room, and it wasn't me. Which means I need the location from someone who knows this building better than my blueprints do. Another pause. Then wake her up, Silvio said. Wake Marcella up and ask her. Dante felt the particular quality of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. Marcella. His mother, who had lived in this house for extended periods across 6 years of visits, who had walked every corridor and room and had opinions about all of them. Who knew this building the way a person knows a place they've considered their own, even when it doesn't belong to them. She wouldn't know about the safe room. He was certain of that. Certain that the renovation had been too discreet, too separated from the main work for her to have registered it. But she knew the building's layout well enough to give Silvio's people a working map of the 3rd floor that would reduce the search to something manageable. And she would. He knew that too, with the particular clarity of a man who spent the past 4 hours assembling a picture of how far his mother had already been willing to go. He had maybe 6 minutes. He moved. He came around the corner of the kitchen corridor fast and low, and the man standing at the main hall entrance, one of Silvio's, 25 or so, holding a radio at his side, had about 1.5 seconds to register that someone was coming before Dante closed the distance, stripped the radio from his hand with his left, and put the barrel of Boots' gun against the side of the man's jaw with his right. The man went absolutely still. How many on the 3rd floor? Dante said quietly. The man breathed. His eyes were moving, calculating, which was not a good sign because calculating meant trained, and trained meant this was going to take more than the gun at his jaw to resolve. I'm going to ask one more time, Dante said, and after that I'm going to assume none, which is going to be bad for whoever's up there when I arrive without any information about them. 2, the man said. His voice was flat. Giving information, not cooperating. There was a difference. East corridor and the stair landing. Silvio? Where? Lower level. A pause. Command room. Dante had set up a private command room in the lower level of the estate 5 years ago. It was where he ran sensitive operations, kept the critical records, maintained the infrastructure for the parts of his organization that required the most security. It was the most fortified room in the building. It was also, by design, accessible only through a single corridor that could be sealed from inside. If Silvio was in the command room, he had made a decision. He was no longer maneuvering through the house. He was fortifying, which meant he was waiting for either Dante to come to him or for something else to change the equation. Someone to be captured, some leverage to materialize. The leverage was on the 3rd floor. Dante secured the man with the zip ties from his own tactical vest. The same type they'd used on Emilio, which was either ironic or practical and right now was purely practical, and left him in the kitchen corridor with his radio out of reach. He went up the main staircase. Not the service stairs this time. The main staircase was watched, but he was done moving around the edges of his own house. He went up the center, fast, and the man at the top of the stairs had half a second to raise his weapon before Dante was already inside his reach, which is the one place a gun becomes a problem for the person holding it rather than the person it's pointed at. The weapon discharged into the ceiling. The gunshot was enormous in the enclosed space, ringing through the whole floor. And then it was no longer in anyone's hands, and the man was on the floor. Dante's ears were ringing. He kept moving, took the weapon. Two in hand now, he moved east. The second man on the third floor heard him coming. The gunshot had removed the element of surprise for the rest of the building, which was a cost Dante had accepted the moment he chose the main staircase. He came around the junction corner at a run and found the man already in a defensive crouch with his weapon raised, and they looked at each other for a half second across about 20 feet of corridor. "Put it down," Dante said. The man didn't move. He was young, mid-20s, the same approximate vintage as Ferrar and Luca. He had the specific expression of someone who has been put in a position they didn't entirely understand and is now determining whether the people who put them there are worth what this is starting to cost. "Silvio told you I'd be the one to deal with," Dante said. His voice was level. The ringing in his ears was fading. "He told you I was soft, that I'd been distracted, that when it came to an actual confrontation I would—" He paused. "Look at me, and decide if that's accurate." The man's weapon arm dropped 2 inches. Not all the way. 2 inches. "You don't want to be the last man standing between me and my wife," Dante said. "Whatever he's paying you, whatever he told you about what comes next, you don't want to be that." 4 seconds. The man lowered his weapon. Dante moved past him. He didn't take the gun. He didn't have time, and the man had already made his decision. He knocked at the safe room panel in the sequence, and it opened. Cass stepped back from the entrance. Behind him, Nia was standing. She had moved off the bench, was on her feet, one hand on the interior wall for balance. Her face when she saw him did something that he registered and then deliberately did not think about, because thinking about it was going to cost him something he needed to hold on to for approximately 40 more minutes. "Silvio's in the command room," Dante said. "Lower level, single access corridor." "He can seal it from inside," Nia said immediately. He looked at her. "You showed me the building plans when we moved in," she said. "I paid attention." He had shown her the building plans. He'd done it because he believed she should understand the place she was living in, and because Nia had asked to see them, and because refusing to let his wife understand the architecture of her own home had seemed like exactly the kind of decision that turned a house into a different kind of prison. He had not been thinking about emergency utility. She had apparently been thinking about several things he hadn't anticipated. "The corridor seal works from inside," she said, "which means if he's locked in, you need him to open it, which means you need something that makes opening it worth his while." She paused. "Or you need the override." "The override requires the administrative code and a physical key," Dante said. "The key is in your desk. Second drawer, under the false bottom." He stared at her. "You've opened that drawer in your sleep," she said. "4 years of watching you. I wasn't trying to... I just noticed." A pause. "The code is different." "I know the code." "Then go." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. 8 months spent, standing in a hidden room in red emergency light, telling him to go deal with the man who had spent a year engineering her isolation and was now somewhere below them with a fortified position and Dante's head of security as a hostage. He went. He retrieved the key from the study. "I went down both stairwells, service stairs to the ground floor, main hall to the lower level access, moving fast through the emergency lit corridors and past the 2 secured men and through the intersection that led to the lower level passage." Marco was in the lower level passage. Not secured. Standing. With a split lip and a posture that said he'd had a harder few hours than Dante, but was functional and had decided to stay functional through an act of pure will. "I got out through the utility access before they sealed the floor," Marco said. He didn't waste time on explanation. "I've been waiting. I couldn't reach you." "I know. How many between here and the command room?" 2 in the corridor. Armed." Marco paused. "Emilio?" Dining room, secured but alive. Marco's breath came out. Okay. I need you to go to the dining room. Emilio's zip-tied to a chair. I need him loose, and I need both of you covering the exterior when this ends. Because when the command room opens, there are going to be men in this building who need to understand that what's happening is over. Marco nodded. He started to move. Marco. The older man stopped. The man in this dining room, the outside hire. Broad, broken face. I don't know him. Marco's expression shifted. I know him. His name is Teller. He's done work for the Calumet operation. He doesn't have loyalty to any one structure. He has an arrangement for tonight. A pause. He has a family. Dante understood what Marco was telling him. Teller was outside muscle, but outside muscle could be reasoned with through the right channels. The arrangement that brought him here could be superseded by... The arrangement is being renegotiated, Dante said. Tell him the person who made the original arrangement is about to be in federal custody, which makes the original payment structure somewhat academic. Marco's face moved in something that might, under different circumstances, have been called a smile. He went toward the dining room. Dante went toward the command room corridor. The two men in the corridor saw him coming, and the first one raised his weapon, and Dante kept walking, because there is a particular quality of forward momentum that can, in certain circumstances, communicate something that no words can. A complete and absolute refusal to acknowledge the possibility of being stopped, projected outward like a physical force. He kept walking. Stop, the first man said. Dante walked. I said, I heard you, Dante said, still walking. 15 feet. 10. You're in a corridor in a house that belongs to me, working for a man who is going to be in a federal holding facility within 72 hours. And you have a choice about whether your name is on any of the paperwork that puts him there. He stopped 5 feet from the first man. Or you can shoot me, but you should know that if you do, the 12 people in this building who are connected to Silvio become the primary subjects of the most thorough federal and organizational investigation this city has seen in 15 years. Because the people who are looking for a reason to dismantle this organization have been waiting for something exactly like tonight, and you shooting me in a corridor is the gift that makes all of their paperwork significantly easier. He was not bluffing about the federal component. He had, across 16 years, maintained a relationship with a specific federal intermediary, not cooperation, not informing, something more nuanced and mutual, that he had never used and had maintained precisely for a situation that required a threat credible enough that it didn't need to be carried out. The first man lowered his weapon. The second followed. Dante walked between them to the command room door. He inserted the physical key. He entered the administrative code, 14 digits that he had memorized and never written down. The mechanical seal released with a sound like an exhaled breath. He pushed the door open. The command room was not large. It had been designed for function, not comfort. Long table, monitors, communication equipment, a wall of locked filing cabinets. The emergency lighting in here was brighter than the rest of the lower level because it ran off its own dedicated battery system. Silvio was standing at the far end of the table. He looked like a man who had been expecting a different version of this moment. He was dressed practically, dark clothes, nothing that suggested he'd been asleep when Farrar's call came in. He'd been ready. He'd been waiting for the right moment, and when Dante's early return created an unexpected timeline, he'd moved to contingency. He had a gun in his hand, not raised, at his side, but in his hand. Dante looked at it, then looked at Silvio. 41 years old, dark eyes, the Viscari build, lean and angular, the kind of face that in certain lights looked like it had been carved rather than grown. Dante had known this face for as long as he could remember anything. He had sat across from it at family tables and strategy sessions, and difficult conversations, and easy ones. He had trusted it with things that he had trusted to almost no one else. You opened the door, Silvio said. His voice was careful, assessing. It's my door, Dante said. The men in the corridor made a different calculation. Silvio looked at him. Really looked. The way you look at someone when you're trying to determine how far from the script the situation has traveled. His gun hand was still at his side. This isn't finished, Silvio said. You think it is because you got through the corridor and you opened the door, but it isn't finished. There are people in this organization who have already committed to the transition. People who believed what you told them, Dante said, which is different. They made choices. So did you. Silvio's jaw tightened. I made the choices that kept this organization functional while you were— Stop! Dante's voice cut through the room. Stop telling me about the organization. I've heard the argument. I understand the argument. The argument is that I became a liability because I loved someone and I let that change me. And in your assessment, that change made me weak and you decided to remove me. A pause. Is that accurate? Silvio said nothing. Because that's the argument, Dante said. And here's my answer to it. You're right that I changed. You're right that Nia changed me. You are wrong. You are completely, catastrophically wrong about what direction I changed in. He took one step into the room. You think love made me soft. What it actually did was give me something worth being harder for. You don't understand that distinction because you've never had it. And I'm sorry for that, Silvio. I genuinely am, because it means you built all of this. He gestured at the room, at the building around it, at the entirety of the past 18 months, out of a misunderstanding. The gun came up. Not slowly. Fast. The motion of a man who has processed that the conversation is over and has moved to the only remaining option. Dante was already moving, left and forward, not back. Never back, because back put him in the doorway. And the doorway was a kill box. Left and forward, inside the angle, and his hand came up under Silvio's gun arm and pushed it toward the ceiling as the weapon discharged. The shot went into the acoustic tile above them. Plaster rained down. They were close enough that Dante could hear Silvio breathing, ragged, hard, the breathing of a man who has been running on adrenaline in preparation for months and has just reached the moment where both of those run out. The gun was between them. Silvio was strong, always had been. And for 3 seconds it was purely a question of physics and leverage, and which of them wanted it more? Dante wanted it more. He drove Silvio backward into the far wall, felt the impact through both of them, and the gun came free and hit the floor and skidded under the filing cabinet. Silvio's elbow connected with Dante's cheekbone on the way down, and the pain was immediate and bright and completely ignorable, because there was no version of this room in which Dante stopped. Silvio hit the floor. Dante had him by the collar and his knee in the man's chest, and Silvio was looking up at him with an expression that had finally dropped every layer of calculated performance and was just a man who had lost and knew it. He was breathing hard. Dante was breathing hard. The plaster dust from the ceiling was still settling around them. It's over, Dante said. Silvio's mouth moved. Something that might have been a word and didn't make it all the way out. It's over, Dante said again. Not angry, not triumphant, just factual. Everything you built, the parallel structure, the financial accounts, the loyalty you bought, the evidence you manufactured, all of it is already documented, and it's going somewhere you can't follow it. He paused. And Nia is fine. Your men are standing down. Emilio is loose. Marco has the building. He could hear, even as he said it, the sounds of that being true. Voices in the upper corridors, movement that had the quality of resolution rather than conflict, the specific acoustic signature of a situation that has reached its conclusion, and the people in it are beginning to understand that. Silvio closed his eyes. His hands, which had been gripping Dante's coat, went flat on the floor. You're going to turn me over, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Dante said. The organization is not your concern anymore. Silvio was quiet for a moment. The emergency lighting hummed overhead. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. She's going to be fine, Silvio, Dante said quietly. My daughter is going to be fine, despite everything you put in place to prevent that. He stood. He looked down at his cousin on the floor of the command room, and he felt something that was grief and fury and exhaustion all braided together, and none of it was going to be useful to him right now, so he set it aside with the same deliberateness he'd been applying to everything else tonight. I need you to stand up, Dante said, and I need you to walk out of this room under your own power, because in about 3 minutes, there are going to be people in this building who are going to be watching how this ends, and how it ends is going to tell them what comes next. And what comes next is not what you planned. Silvio opened his eyes. He looked at Dante for a long moment with an expression that Dante couldn't fully read and wasn't going to try to. Then, slowly, he sat up. And then, slowly, he stood. And they stood facing each other in the room where Dante had made the decisions that built his empire. And outside the room, the sounds of the house were changing again. Feet on stairs, voices in corridors. The estate beginning to breathe differently as the night shifted toward whatever came after this. And Dante looked at the man who had tried to take everything from him and thought about Nia in the safe room upstairs, and the music box still on the kitchen counter, and the small, slightly imperfect melody it played, and he thought, not yet, not the end yet. Because there was still Marcella waiting somewhere in the house, and there were still 12 men whose futures needed to be decided, and there was still an organization that had been fractured at its core and would not hold together on reputation alone. And there was still a conversation he needed to have with every captain and crew leader about what the next 24 hours were going to require of them. And upstairs, in a hidden room behind a wall that his cousin had never found, his wife was waiting with his unborn daughter, and he had told them both that he had the beginning of a plan. He needed the rest of it. He looked at Silvio and said simply, "Walk." And Silvio walked, and Dante followed him out of the command room and into the corridor and up toward the light, and the night that had broken open around all of them was not over, but the part of it that Dante Viscari could not survive had passed, and what remained now was the part that would determine not just whether he lived, but what kind of man he would be when morning came. Silvio walked out of the command room on his own 2 feet, which was what Dante had asked for, and the asking had been practical rather than merciful. How a man walks out of a room tells everyone watching something about the room he's leaving and the man who made him leave it. The corridor outside the command room had 4 people in it by the time they emerged. 2 of Dante's men, who had come down from the upper floors after Emilio had been freed and had taken positions at either end of the passage without being asked, which told Dante that Emilio had given instructions before Dante had a chance to, which told him that Emilio was functional and thinking clearly despite the cut above his eye and whatever else the night had cost him. Marco was there too, standing near the corridor junction with his arms at his sides and his split lip dried to a dark line. And Teller, the outside man, the broad-shouldered one from the dining room, was standing slightly apart from the others with the specific posture of a man who has recalculated his position and is waiting to see whether the new calculation holds. Nobody spoke when Dante and Silvio came out. They didn't need to. The situation communicated itself in the way situations do when the people present are experienced enough to read them without annotation. Dante stopped at the corridor junction. He looked at Teller. "You're done for tonight," he said. "Marco will give you a number. You call it in 72 hours. Don't come back to this property." Teller looked at him for a moment. His face was the kind of face that didn't give away much as a matter of professional habit. But he nodded, once, and then he walked toward the stairwell without looking at Silvio, which told Dante that whatever loyalty Teller had sold tonight had already been quietly repurchased. Good. He looked at the two men at either end of the corridor. Both of them had come in with Silvio tonight, not the estate's regular security, not men who answered to Dante's established hierarchy. They had positioned themselves at either end of the passage with their weapons holstered, which was the only reason they were still standing where they were. "Your employer's arrangement is concluded," Dante said. He said it without anger, without the particular cruelty that would have made the statement into something it didn't need to be. Just factual. Just the way the night had resolved itself, laid out for people who needed to understand it quickly and move accordingly. You have two options. You leave this property now through the North Service exit, and nobody here has seen you tonight, or you stay and you become part of what happens to him. He tilted his head towards Silvio without looking at him. Take the exit. They took the exit. Silvio watched them go. His face through all of this had the quality of a man watching a house he built get disassembled brick by brick, each brick removed without particular violence, just methodically and completely. He had built something over 18 months. He had built it with patience and intelligence and a genuine conviction, however distorted, that what he was doing was necessary. And it was being taken apart in the same corridor where he'd thought he'd secured the building, and the people he'd brought in to make it real were walking out the North Service exit. "The captains," Silvio said. His voice was low, controlled enough that only Dante could hear it clearly. "The ones I brought over. They're going to need to answer to someone." "They'll answer to me," Dante said, "after what I told them about you." "After what you told them about me," Dante said, "they're going to be extremely relieved to discover that I'm alive and standing in front of them. People who've backed the wrong position don't want more conflict. They want a path to acceptable. I'll give them one." He paused. "The ones who can't accept that path will find out what happens when they don't. But that's a conversation for tomorrow." Silvio said nothing else. There was nothing left in his toolkit for this room. No more leverage, no more arguments, no more versions of the case he'd been building. He had run out of everything except the fact of himself, standing in a corridor at 4 a.m. in a house where every advantage he'd constructed had been stripped away piece by piece. Marco stepped forward and took Silvio by the arm. Not roughly. Just took his arm and turned him toward the stairwell, the way you walk someone who has agreed to be walked, rather than someone who needs to be forced. Dante watched them go. He stood in the corridor alone for a moment. The emergency lighting hummed. Somewhere upstairs a door opened, the building settling back into itself after a night that had put every joint and hinge under a different kind of pressure. He went to find Emilio. Emilio was in the kitchen, seated at the island with a cloth pressed against the cut above his eye. One of the estate staff, the night shift woman whose name was Prue, a 60-year-old with a face like deliberate patience, was standing beside him with a first aid kit and the expression of someone who had seen worse and was reserving judgment. When Dante walked in, Emilio started to stand. "Don't," Dante said. Emilio sat back down. He looked at Dante's face. The cheekbone where Silvio's elbow had connected was swelling. Dante could feel it. And his expression moved through several things quickly before settling on something that was mostly professional and partly personal and entirely honest. "I should have pushed harder on the memo," Emilio said. "You said that already. I'm saying it again. I heard it both times." Dante sat down across from him at the island. Prue looked between them and quietly continued cleaning the cut, which was a small act of grace that Dante appreciated more than he showed. "How bad is the eye?" "It'll close tomorrow. I've had worse." Emilio paused. "The men Silvio brought in, the ones I don't recognize. Most of them are gone. 2 are secured on the upper floor. Marco will handle the documentation. And our people? The ones who were on overnight rotation when the power cut happened? I need a count by morning. Anyone who was outside when the perimeter went dark. I need to know where they are and what condition they're in." He paused. Boots. Boots was on the northeast perimeter. Emilio's jaw tightened. "I haven't been able to reach him." Dante felt that land. Boots, who had worked this property for over a decade and kept a gun in a dish towel drawer because he believed in preparedness without being asked to, who had, tonight, been standing on a perimeter designed by the man who wanted the estate's owner dead. "Find him," Dante said. "First thing." Dante stood. He looked at the kitchen counter. The music box was still there. He'd left it before all of it started, and it had sat through the entire night without moving, which was somehow the most precise possible symbol for everything that had happened. The small thing he'd come home to give, the thing that had been waiting on the counter while the house tore itself apart around it. He picked it up and put it in his coat pocket. He went upstairs. He knocked at the safe room panel in sequence. Cass opened it. Nia was sitting on the bench again. She'd sat back down at some point, because standing for 3 hours while 8 months pregnant is simply not sustainable regardless of the circumstances. And Nia had always been someone who made practical decisions even when her emotions were running high. She looked up when the panel opened. She looked at his face, at the swelling cheekbone, at his hands, which had plaster dust and someone else's blood on the knuckles. She said, "Is it over?" "Yes," he said. She let out a breath. Not a dramatic exhale, just a quiet release. The kind that happens when a body finally believes something the mind has been telling it for a while. She put both hands on the bench beside her and stood up slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a woman whose body has been carrying more than its intended weight for longer than it should have. Dante stepped into the room and put his arms around her. She leaned into him, not collapsing, not releasing into it, just allowing herself to be held, which was its own kind of statement from someone who had been holding themselves together by force of will for hours that felt like weeks. They stood like that for a moment. The emergency lighting was still running. The house around them was quiet in a way it hadn't been since before any of this started. Then Nia said, into his coat, "Your cheekbone." "Silvio's elbow." "How's his elbow?" "It'll live." She pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She had not cried through any of this, which did not mean she hadn't felt it. Dante knew exactly what it cost her to hold herself like that, because he'd watched her do it across 8 months of a pregnancy that should have been simpler and hadn't been. "What happens now?" she said. "Now we deal with what's left." "Marcella." He said nothing for a moment, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer was going to be real and concrete, and he wanted to say it once, completely, without having to revise it. "Marcella," he confirmed. Nia looked at him steadily. "I don't want to be in the room for that." "You won't be. And I don't want to be told about it afterward in a way that's designed to protect me from the details." He understood what she was asking, not insulation, honesty, even when the honesty was uncomfortable, especially when it was. "Okay," he said. She reached up and touched his swollen cheekbone very gently with 2 fingers, not examining it, not treating it, just touching it. The way you touch something to confirm it's real. "Go," she said. "Finish it." He went. Marcella was in the east sitting room. She had been escorted there by one of Emilio's men when the lockdown began and had, according to the brief report Dante received from Cass on his way down the hall, spent most of the past 3 hours sitting in the same chair near the window, with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged into an expression of composed indignation that suggested she had decided the best position available to her was moral certainty. When Dante walked in, she looked at him. She looked at his face, the cheekbone, the dust on his coat, the general appearance of a man who had been through several hours of something physical and had come out the other side. Her expression didn't change. The composed indignation held, which told him that she had not yet determined that holding it was the wrong choice. He sat down across from her. He didn't speak immediately. He was very tired. It was the kind of tired that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but settles into the body with the quiet authority of something that has been postponed all night and is now presenting its bill. "Silvio is in custody," he said. "Not police custody. That comes in the morning. But he's secured. He's not in a position to influence anything, and everything he built over the past 18 months is going to be documented and handed over through channels that will make certain none of it can be reconstructed." He paused. "The financial records, the communication intercepts, the forged authorizations, the parallel loyalty structure, all of it." Marcella looked at him. "I want to talk to you about your part in it," Dante said. "I didn't know about Silvio's—" "I know you didn't know about the financial element," Dante said. He kept his voice even. This was one of the most important things he'd ever said to his mother, and he was going to say it correctly, which meant without anger distorting the delivery. "I know you didn't know about the communication intercepts or the assassination arrangement. I believe that. Silvio used you. He used your feelings about Nia as a mechanism. He gave you the environment, the access, the implicit permission to do what you were already inclined to do, and he pointed it in the direction that served his purpose. You were a tool he operated." He let that sit for a moment. "That's what happened." Marcella's face moved. Something cracked in the composed surface. Not collapsed, just cracked. A line through it. "However," Dante said. She looked at him. "You still chose every single thing you did. Silvio didn't make you take the soup away. Silvio didn't make you tell my pregnant wife she didn't deserve to stand beside me. He didn't make you grab her wrist." He paused. "He gave you the room to be what you were already willing to be. The choice was still yours." Marcella's hands, folded in her lap, tightened. "I was protecting this family," she said. Her voice had shifted, less composed now, something rawer underneath it. "That woman doesn't understand what we are, what you are. I have watched you build something that your father, that everything in our history. I have watched you build something extraordinary, and then I watched you hand the keys to a woman who walked in from outside with nothing and doesn't have the first understanding of what it costs to stop." His voice was quiet, but it stopped her completely. "Nia understands exactly what it costs. She has spent 2 years paying the cost while you made certain nobody in this house acknowledged that she was paying it. And she paid it without telling me because she was trying to protect me from having to choose between you and her." He looked at his mother steadily. "That is what understanding costs." The room was quiet. Marcella looked at him, and for the first time in Dante's adult memory, the Marcella who looked back at him was not the composed, certain woman who had moved through their entire family history with the impenetrable conviction that she knew what was right and was prepared to enforce it. The woman who looked at him was older, smaller, someone who had spent months operating in the direction of her conviction and had arrived somewhere she had not anticipated. "You're sending me away," she said. "Yes." She didn't argue. That surprised him. He had expected argument, had prepared for it, had organized what he needed to say in response to it. But she didn't argue. She looked at her hands in her lap, and then she looked at the window behind which the lake and the city were beginning, just barely, to show the first gray suggestion of morning. "The house in Oak Park," she said. "Yes." She had lived there before she moved into the estate. It was hers. Dante had never taken ownership, never made it anything other than her property. It was a good house. She had maintained it even after largely relocating to the estate, which he had always interpreted as a failure to commit to the new arrangement. He understood now that it had been something else, a held position, a retreat she'd kept ready. "Will you—" She stopped, started again. The child. Her name is Maya, Dante said. We decided weeks ago. Marcella looked at him when he said that. At the name. At the fact that the name had already been chosen, and she had not known it, and would not have been the person they told. She nodded once, a very small movement. When she's old enough to understand, Dante said carefully, and when Nia decides she's comfortable with it, I'll tell you. He paused. That's the offer. It's the only one on the table, and it requires that what happened in this house never happens again in any form. Not a word, not a look, not a single thing that resembles what you allowed yourself to do here. If it does... He stopped. He looked at his mother. I'm not going to finish that sentence. You're going to have to trust that I mean what I've said, and I'm going to have to trust that you understand what it costs me to say it this way instead of a different way. Marcella looked at him for a long moment. Her face was doing something complicated that he didn't entirely want to examine because examining it would require him to access a part of himself that was, at 4:30 in the morning after this particular night, not available for navigation. She stood up. She smoothed her clothes. She picked up the small bag that she apparently had with her. She had known, then, at some level, that she might need to leave tonight. Had prepared for it. He didn't know what to do with that information, so he set it down. The child will have Viscari blood, Marcella said. It wasn't a challenge. It was something else, almost a question, almost something she was confirming to herself rather than saying to him. She'll have her mother's name first, Dante said. Maya Whitmore Viscari. Because her mother earned the name she already carries, and because standing beside me costs something, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure that's acknowledged. Marcella walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She didn't turn around, but she said, quietly enough that it was almost not there. She was stronger than I expected. She left. Dante sat in the east sitting room for a few minutes after she was gone. The chair was not comfortable. The room was cold. The heating had not been restored since the power cut, and the backup systems maintained minimal function throughout the building, but not comfort. He sat in the cold and the quiet and let the night finish settling into him. Then he got up, because there was still work. By 6 in the morning, the documentation was assembled. Marco had worked through the pre-dawn hours with two of Dante's most trusted captains, men who had been with the organization long enough to understand what the paperwork represented and what it would accomplish, and what it would cost everyone named in it. The financial records, the communication logs, the personnel connections, Silvio's parallel network, mapped in full, the forged authorizations, the evidence of the assassination arrangement, which had been organized through a third-party intermediary whose name appeared in Silvio's personal files alongside an account number that had received 3 separate payments over the preceding 4 months. At 6:15, Dante called the federal intermediary. The call was brief. Dante gave him a location, a time, and a single sentence of context. There was a package that would be useful, and the person delivering it expected nothing in return except the understanding that the delivery was complete, and nobody on a specific list would be troubled by federal interest for the next 12 months. The intermediary didn't ask questions. They had worked at this particular distance for years without questions. The relationship had always been built on the understanding that what each of them needed from the other was specific and bounded, and that the transaction ended at the boundary. At 7 in the morning, Silvio was transferred to a location off the estate by Marco and 2 others. He did not resist. He had been sitting in the lower-level conference room since 4 in the morning with a cup of coffee. He'd mostly left undrunk, and when Marco came to get him, he stood up and walked without being asked to. He looked, in the early morning light coming through the narrow window, like someone who had been awake for days, which was accurate, and like someone who had decided that the energy required for performance was no longer available, which was also accurate. At the door of the conference room, he stopped and looked back at Dante. "The captains who came over to my side," he said. "The ones who made promises to me. What happens to them?" Dante considered whether to answer. He decided to, because Silvio was going somewhere from which he would not be directing anything, and the question had in it something that was almost concern for people other than himself, and Dante thought it deserved an honest reply. "They'll be given the chance to recommit," Dante said. "Individually, on record. The ones who do it honestly will keep their positions and their standing. The ones who don't," he paused, "will be moved to positions where their inclinations can't cause the kind of damage yours did." Silvio nodded. He looked at Dante for a moment. The expression on his face was difficult to read, and Dante didn't try very hard. Some things don't resolve into a readable meaning. Some things just exist in the space between people who have known each other for decades and have arrived at the end of something that can't be walked back. "I believed it," Silvio said. "What I told myself about why it had to be this way. I need you to know that. I know that doesn't change what it was. But I believed it." Dante said, "I know you did." That was all. Marco walked Silvio out, and Dante stood in the doorway of the conference room and listened to the footsteps going up the stairs, and then the sound of the exterior door, and then the quiet of a house that had returned to itself. He found Boots at 7:45. Boots had taken a hit to the head during the initial incursion. One of Silvio's outside men had come over the northeast perimeter at the same moment the power was cut and had encountered Boots on his patrol round. Boots was 63 years old and had been in security work for 38 years and had spent 15 of those years doing exactly what he did at this estate, which was watching a perimeter carefully and maintaining equipment and keeping a loaded gun in a dish towel drawer without being asked. He had a concussion and a gash along his hairline that required stitches, and he had been conscious in the northwest corner of the property since approximately 3 in the morning, sitting against the exterior wall in the dark and waiting for someone to find him, because his radio had been taken, and he decided that moving with a head wound in the dark was less useful than staying put. When Emilio found him and brought him inside, Boots' first question was whether the boss was okay. His second question was whether anyone had found the secondary firearm he kept in the North Garden equipment shed for exactly this category of situation. Dante, when he heard this, went to the North Garden equipment shed himself. He did not tell anyone where he was going. He needed 5 minutes alone outside in the cold morning air, and the equipment shed was a reason that was also a real reason, and the gun was there exactly where Boots had said it would be. He stood in the shed for a few minutes. The morning was gray and cold, and the lake was visible through the shed's single small window, the water dark and flat and impossibly calm given everything. He stood and looked at it and let the night complete its transaction with him. The cost counted up, the things it had taken, the things that had almost been taken. He went back inside. At 9 in the morning, he sat down with his 7 senior captains in the main conference room on the ground floor. The room had windows. The emergency lighting had been replaced by real light. The power had been restored at 7, quietly and without ceremony, because Emilio had located the junction box damage and had a technician address it before most of the morning staff arrived. The room looked like it always looked. The men in it looked like men who had been awake all night and were present anyway because being present was the job. Dante told them what had happened. He told them plainly and completely. The financial irregularities, the forged authorizations, the parallel loyalty structure, the assassination arrangement. He did not editorialize. He did not frame it as a story with a moral. He told them facts and let the facts be what they were. There was no sound in the room for a moment after he finished. Then one of the captains, a man named Greco, 53 years old, who had been with the organization since before Dante's tenure, said, "The captains who were working with Silvio, Are we looking at them differently now? We're going to have individual conversations, Dante said, starting today. I need honest assessments from each of them about what they knew and when and what they agreed to. The conversations will be direct. He paused. But the goal isn't punishment. The goal is functional clarity about where this organization stands and who's in it and why. And after that, Greco asked. Dante looked at him. Greco was not asking about immediate logistics. I was asking about the larger question, the one that every man in the room had been sitting with since Dante started talking, about what the organization looked like on the other side of a night like this, about whether there was an other side that looked like the thing they'd been part of. After that, Dante said, we're going to make some changes. He outlined them. Not everything. Some of it wasn't settled yet, wasn't ready to be said precisely because saying things imprecisely to rooms full of people who need precision is how you create the next problem. But the core of it, the illegal operations that were going to be wound down, the timeline for doing it, the separation of the legitimate business structure from the organizational hierarchy, the redistribution of responsibility that came with that separation, the pathway toward a version of what they'd built that could exist without requiring everyone in it to be prepared constantly for nights like the one they'd just had. Greco said, that's a significant change. Yes, Dante said. Some of them won't accept it. Some of them will leave. That's acceptable. What's not acceptable is building something that survives only as long as everyone inside it is either loyal or afraid. Because afraid is not a foundation. Afraid is a loan with interest you can't see until it comes due. He paused. I found out what the interest looks like last night. The room was quiet. Then Greco said, You're serious? I have a daughter coming, Dante said. In a few weeks. Her name is Maya. She's going to grow up in a world that I'm partially responsible for shaping. I've been operating as if that responsibility ended at the property line. He looked at the table. It doesn't. Nobody argued. Whether that was agreement or deference or simply exhaustion, Dante didn't know and wasn't going to push for clarification this morning. The clarification would come over weeks and months and individual conversations, and some of it would be hard, and some of the men in this room would not be here by the end of it. And all of that was real and true, and he was going to deal with it as it came. He dismissed the meeting at 10:30. He went upstairs. He knocked once on the bedroom door. Nia said, Come in. She was in bed. She had finally gone back to bed at some point during the morning, and she was sitting up against the headboard with her hands resting on her belly and the small bedside lamp on because it was still overcast outside and the room was dim. She looked at him when he came in. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him for 4 years, with a directness that had never once made him feel like she was looking for someone else. Marcella? She said. Oak Park. She left at 5. Nia nodded. She didn't say anything else about it. She wasn't going to perform relief or satisfaction or any of the responses that would have been understandable and were not what she was made of. Silvio, she said. Gone. The federal process starts today. It'll take time, but it'll be complete. She nodded again. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the music box and set it on the nightstand beside the lamp. He wound the key. He had to wind it several times. It had been in his pocket for hours, and the mechanism needed to be fully tensioned. The melody started. Small and slightly imperfect, and older than both of them, something that sounded like it had been passed from hand to hand across years before reaching this room. Nia looked at it. Then she looked at him. You bought that before you came home, she said. In the afternoon. I had 1 hour. You spent it on a music box. I couldn't think of what else to get. She reached over and touched the top of the box with one finger, the way she'd touched his cheekbone earlier. to confirm it was real. The melody continued playing, thin and clear in the quiet room. "I'm going to need you to tell me the truth about something," she said. He looked at her. "Last night, in the corridor when you first walked in." She paused. She was choosing words with the careful exactness of someone who has been thinking about this for hours. "You stood in the dark for a while before you came in. I knew you were there. I could feel it. I didn't know why you weren't coming in." He was quiet. I'm not asking to assign blame," she said. "I'm asking because I need to understand. Were you deciding? When you were standing there, were you deciding whether to—" "No," he said. "I was listening. I was making sure I understood what I was seeing before I walked into it. That's not the same thing." She looked at him. "It's not the same thing," he said again. "I need you to believe that." "I do," she said. And then, after a pause, "I just needed to hear you say it." He reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were warm now. They had been cold in the kitchen, and they were warm now, and that small temperature change across the course of one night felt like the most complete measurement of everything that had happened and everything that had been held on to through it. "4 weeks," she said. Her other hand rested on her belly. "Approximately." "Are you going to be here?" "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking if you'll try. I'm asking if you'll be here." He understood the distinction. He'd been in the business of trying for 16 years. He'd been in the business of intention and effort and strategic presence, while the actual presence went to everything else. What she was asking was different. What she was asking was the thing he'd been standing in front of all night without having the precise language for it, and now that she'd given him the language, he wasn't going to waste it. "I'll be here," he said. The music box played the slightly imperfect melody through twice more and then ran down, the way music boxes do. Gradually, gently, the mechanism slowing and the notes stretching until the last one hung in the air longer than the others and then faded. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the sky had lightened from gray to a pale, non-committal white. Not sunny, not storming, just the ordinary, ambiguous light of a November morning in Chicago that was going to be what it was going to be, regardless of what anyone in the room had been through the night before. Dante sat on the edge of the bed with his wife's hand in his, and the empty music box on the nightstand and the accumulated weight of a night that had cost him more than he'd walked in carrying, and he thought about Maya, who was not here yet and would be here soon, and about the world she was going to arrive in. It was going to be different from the world he'd built. He understood that now in a way he hadn't fully understood before, not because someone had told him, but because he'd walked through the specific geography of what the alternative looked like and had not liked what he saw. Different didn't mean safe. He wasn't under any illusion about that. The work of making something different was going to be long and imperfect and full of days when the old structure was easier and the new one wasn't finished yet. There were going to be men who didn't accept the change. There were going to be debts that came due and decisions that cost more than he'd planned for. There were going to be conversations with his daughter someday, when she was old enough, that he was not looking forward to and was going to have anyway. But she was going to grow up in a house where the people inside it weren't watching to see which way the power ran before they decided how to treat her mother. That was the start. He reached over and picked up the music box and wound the key again. He handed it to Nia. She held it in both hands and looked at it. The melody started again, small and imperfect and present, playing in a room where the emergency lights were off and the regular lamp was on, and two people who had made it through the night were sitting close enough to each other that neither one had to say anything to know the other was there. The lake outside caught what little light the morning had managed and held it. The city went about its business. The house breathed. Dante Viscari sat beside his wife and listened to the music box play. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately account for, there was nothing else that required his attention right now, in this room, in this particular moment. He stayed.